Hello and welcome to Policy Watch, your packed snapshot of the week's biggest business stories, their context, relevance and impact. I'm Govindraj, Ethiraj. The Indian economy expanded 5.7% between April and June 2014, which is the fastest in the last 2.5 years. Now, the last time the economy did better than this was in the third quarter of the 2011-12 fiscal, when it grew by 6%. Here's a report.
The high growth is attributed to improved performance of mining, manufacturing and services sector. As per the latest data, the manufacturing sector recorded a growth of 3.5% in the first quarter of this fiscal, as against 1.2% contraction recorded during the first quarter of the last fiscal. Mining also grew 2.1% against the negative growth of 3.9% recorded during the same period last fiscal. The highest growth rate during quarter 1 of 2014-15 was recorded by financial services sector at 10.4%, followed by electricity, gas and water supply at 10.2%. Finance Minister Arun Jaitley appreciated the turnaround in the economy and described it as being on expected lines.
Well, what does all of this mean? Well, joining me to find that out is Dr. Arvind Virmani, former Chief Economic Advisor to the Ministry of Finance and Executive Director at the IMF. Also joining me is Ashok Bhattacharya, Editor of Business Standard newspaper. Gentlemen, thank you both for joining us. Dr. Virmani, let me begin with you. So first question is, I know we're straining to find something good in these numbers. While they appear good, are they really as good as they seem?
So everybody has their own benchmark. Mine is very simple. In December, January of this year, I wrote a paper, a policy paper saying what the next government should do. And if they did that, the growth rate would increase by plus 1%, which would roughly be, let's say, 5.7% for the whole year.
Right.
Now, according to my evaluation, they have there were three basic things. One was establishing of confidence, which they have done, which is very evident from the stock market and the capital inflows. The other was what may be summarized as government gridlock, which was all these confusions between Prime Minister, Cabinet, in Cabinet, etc., etc. I think they've done that very successfully. And the third was what was referred to in the manifesto as tax terrorism. Some people object to that word, but whatever you want to call it.
Right.
Now, that has been done partly. Now, as a result of that, I'm confident that, and the results in quarter 1, basically, as far as I'm concerned, tell me that we are on track for that. Now, that does not mean, by the way, that in Q2, the growth rate, in fact, the growth rate in Q2 will be lower because of base effects, etc. But it increases my confidence that my forecast of 5.7 growth will be correct.
Right. Okay. Ashok Bhattacharya, so, you know, we're looking at 2 or 3 sets of data. So the GDP numbers were strong and are unlikely to continue in the same manner as Dr. Virmani has attested as well. But the industrial indices numbers did not see much change. On the other hand, we've seen higher car sales and motorcycle sales numbers. What do we make of all of this? And equally, are we sort of rushing forth with a sort of over-optimistic demeanor as perhaps always?
Well, a couple of things, Govind. Number one, you have seen a resurgence in consumption demand, you know, and which is what has given you the GDP growth numbers of 5.7% in the first quarter of this financial year. Number one. Number two is your investment demand is still very tepid. And if you look at the expenditure side of these GDP numbers, you will see that whereas the gross fixed capital formation has actually declined compared to the same quarter last year. And it is a government expenditure, government consumption expenditure, which has kept the momentum going. So the underlying concern behind these numbers is actually whether the investment demand has picked up, because unless you see the investment demand picking up, this growth will be difficult to sustain. And forget about the base effect. If you do not see a continued surge in investment demand, my fear is, my concern is that your growth recovery may be a little elusive.
Right. So, Dr. Virmani, so investment demand is one sort of peg we want to hang there and wait. What else is missing in this whole equation? Because what you've pointed out is something that is still to kick in and provide real data on ground, isn't it?
Yes and no, because I'm getting the data. So let me there are different perspectives. As I said, it depends on your expectations. Let me take up capital goods and manufacturing. Capital goods, last 2 years growth has been zero or negative in the in the GDP accounts. It's 0.8 and minus 0. The way I read the IIP and the GDP data is actually you are seeing it recovering from zero.
Okay.
Now, obviously, if it's going from negative to positive, it's the direction to me. So to somebody else, I can quite understand what has been said just now, that if it's only less than 1%, is that an improvement? Well, to my eyes, it looked like an improvement.
Okay.
Secondly, on manufacturing, same thing. We've had negative growth. If you look at the quarterly IIP for 8 to 10 quarters, we've been below zero. So now, clearly, these numbers show that it's gone positive. But what was said by my friend earlier about investment is definitely true. There is an agenda for the next 6 to 9 months that you have to revive investment. That is not fully revived. If you don't revive that, you will not get continuing growth. So there is no doubt about that. And there we get into more policies, which we can discuss at some point.
Right. So, Ashok Bhattacharya, what are your fears here? That obviously we've seen a lot of optimism reflected even in the way the stock markets have been hitting new highs every day in the economy as a whole as well. What could we get right and where could we go wrong if we were to continue assuming that things are turning when they actually are not?
Well, there has definitely been a boost to some project clearances that you have seen by giving express approvals to many industrial projects that were waiting to be cleared because of the green lobby against them. So you're going to see some impact of those project clearances going forward. But I think the larger issues that have to be tackled by this Modi government are on the policy front, and mainly what kind of changes you bring about in your land acquisition laws and what kind of changes you bring about in your labor reforms laws. Now, some movement on labor reforms we have seen, but they are only marginal. You need to tackle the larger issues on labor reforms. And secondly, on the land acquisition law, once again, we are hearing promises of some tweaking, some exemption lists being expanded so that the kind of bottleneck that you have seen in land acquisitions over the last few months can be eased a bit. Now, while tweaking is all right, but I think if this country has to realize its potential growth rate of 8% or 8.5%, then I think you need real bold reform measures, particularly on these two areas, on land acquisition laws and labor reforms.
Right. So, yeah. So, so you're also acknowledging that we are not yet, or we are not sort of popping the champagne too early.
Yeah, I would add to that actually. Really, we know from the last 15 years that the driver of growth and productivity has been the corporate sector. So so we can do things on the government side, and that's the danger, that we are making it too much of a government-led investment growth. So you really, without revival of private corporate investment, we are not going to have sustainable growth, of 7%, 8%. So what else needs to be done? Well, that's my third category. I told you about taxation is not enough being done, the fiscal side. So to get real interest rates down, etc., we've still got to control the revenue deficit. We have an expenditure commission. We've got to actualize that over 6 to 9 months and have a subsidy policy. Also on the taxation, the so-called the harassment, etc., there's talk about it, there's a little bit of movement, but not enough in my view. So those are the, besides, of course, the Land Acquisition Act is very important, though I'm less pessimistic than AK on that. But yes, it has to be done. If you don't do it, you will not get corporate investment revival. So you have to get the fiscal back on track so that the monetary policy can ease. I call it a macro pivot. I've argued this for many years now, that we need to tighten the fiscal policy and ease the monetary policy.
Right. So, just to sort of conclude, I mean, are you saying, therefore, or are you acknowledging, therefore, that apart from the optimism itself and the feeling of, the feeling that things are changing, not much has really changed and still has to, and for which a lot of things have to be done.
Let me put it differently. My 3-month program has been met.
Okay.
But there was also in the same paper, people can see it on my website, a 6 to 9 month program.
Right.
That remains to be done.
Right.
So
Okay.
obviously, if you don't do it, then you
We're
won't.
going to slip back.
I'm still reasonably confident we'll get 1% this year, but the question is of sustaining it and increasing it further. No, 5.7 is not satisfactory.
Right.
Next year we need to get at least a percent increase, and for that you need to do much more.
Right, and that's exactly what Mr. Bhattacharya has been telling us as well. So, are you in conclusion? I mean, are you in consonance with that, Ashok Bhattacharya?
Well, yes, I'm particularly concerned by some recent developments with regard to the coal and power crisis, and I think the manner in which these problems are sought to be solved reminds me of the old ways of handling infrastructure issues. So I am a little pessimistic on this count, that unless you really look at the infrastructure bottleneck issues, particularly in the coal and the power sector, and acknowledge the reality of the deficits in these areas and take those necessary steps, policy steps particularly, I think the corporate investment revival can remain a mirage.
Right. So, tackle issues to do with resources on a war footing. Is there anything else? One last word, Dr. Virmani.
Well, on infrastructure, the key problem will be the balance between, for example, the monopoly, what I call the monopoly infrastructure sectors, coal, railways, etc.
Right.
I think it is fine to improve administration, governance in the beginning, but to sustain it, you've got to get to structures and policies eventually. AK is a little more pessimistic. I think they will get to it in enough time to get the higher growth, but that's a judgment.
Okay. And we obviously have a long way to go. I think both of you agree on that.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. We'll take a break on that, but we come back and we'll talk about the Prime Minister Narendra Modi's recent 5-day visit to Japan and what came out of it. Stay with us. Welcome back. Here with Policy Watch. Prime Minister Narendra Modi's 5-day visit to Japan that concluded is seen as a landmark in India-Japan relations. The highlight of the visit was a $35 billion commitment from Japan over the next 5 years for investment in an array of infrastructure projects and industry in India. However, a civil nuclear deal between the two countries remains elusive. Here's a report.
All eyes were on Prime Minister Narendra Modi as he landed at the Osaka airport in Japan. This was the Prime Minister's first bilateral visit outside the Indian subcontinent, and its importance was not lost on anyone. The trip was aimed at boosting ties in infrastructure, trade and defense between the two nations. Modi's first stop was Kyoto, the smart city of Japan. In a special gesture, Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe flew to Kyoto to receive Prime Minister Modi there. In Kyoto, the Prime Minister attended a reception in his honor at the State Guest House. As part of the government's plan to develop 100 smart cities in India, a partnership agreement was signed between Kyoto and Varanasi. In the summit-level talks on Monday, Prime Minister Modi and his Japanese counterpart Shinzo Abe discussed a host of bilateral issues. Even as there was no breakthrough on the civil nuclear deal, Japan has promised substantial investments in other sectors.
21वीं सदी कैसी हो, ये उस बात पर निर्भर करता है कि भारत और जापान मिलकर के किस प्रकार की व्यूहरचना अपनाते हैं, किस रणनीति को लेकर के आगे बढ़ते हैं और कितनी घनिष्ठता के साथ आगे बढ़ते हैं.
Japan has announced that it will double its private and public investment in India to about $34 billion over the next 5 years. This will be under the India-Japan Investment Promotion Partnership for development of projects including infrastructure and building of smart cities. During their summit talks, the two leaders also reaffirmed the importance of bilateral defense relations in their strategic partnership and agreed on greater defense equipment and technology cooperation. Tokyo will also provide financial, technical and operational support to introduce bullet trains in India, a project actively pursued by Prime Minister Modi.
安全保障については、包括的な安全保障、防衛協力を推進していくことで一致をいたしました。また、防衛装備協力に関する協議の開始や、海上安全保障及び救難飛行艇 US2 に関する協力の一層の推進にも合意をいたしました。
But the two sides found no common ground on the civil nuclear deal, even though officials have been told to accelerate negotiations for early conclusion of an agreement to strengthen the partnership.
原子力協力については、過去数ヶ月間に交渉に重要な進展がありました。本日、モディ首相と率直な話し合いを行い、この問題について双方の理解がさらに深まりました。
दुनिया में कई विषयों पर जैसे नॉन प्रोलिफरेशन, स्पेस सिक्योरिटी, साइबर सिक्योरिटी, यूएन रिफॉर्म्स और इस क्षेत्र के रीजनल फोरम्स में साथ मिलकर के हमारे जुड़े हुए हितों को आगे बढ़ा सकते हैं.
Prime Minister Narendra Modi also wooed the country's businesses. Following the summit-level talks with Abe, Prime Minister Modi has promised non-discriminatory and speedy clearances to investors from the country. The Prime Minister praised Japan as he said that India wants to emulate the country in terms of quality, zero defect and delivery systems while carrying out skill development. Bureau Report, Rajya Sabha Television.
Well, $34 billion, that's a lot of money, but do we have the capacity to absorb it, and what do we need to do to ensure that these kind of commitments are converted into real action and projects on ground? Still with me, Dr. Arvind Virmani and Ashok Bhattacharya. Dr. Virmani, let me begin with you. There have been promises like this made in the past. Do we have the ability to convert this into real projects? The bullet train, for instance, seems to be an example on the other extreme because it looks like a grand project which may never see the light of day.
So you have two aspects, right? One is public funding or aid, and the other is private. You mentioned the one which is likely to involve public funding. So if you have a bullet train, it's very risky. So how you're going to formulate it? I have suggested, actually, I just spoke this morning in the Chinese context, but same applies to Japan, is a boot type of concept. Build, own, operate, transfer. So that the risk of this very expensive and risky venture is initially borne by them. So if some arrangement can be worked out, yes, it can be done. The Japanese can do it if they agree to take the risk. So can the Chinese. The second part, of course, is so there's just to end that there is a little bit of competition introduced, which is good, I think. So if Japan is going to do it, maybe China will say, okay, we will do a boot, and maybe France will say. So that's one of the side benefits.
Right.
Secondly, on the FDI, I think perhaps you didn't mention, but maybe people noted that they were also talking about the doubling of the number of firms. So it's not just FDI, it's more firms. And that's very important to my way of looking at it, because part of it is not just money, it's not just finance. It is ideas, it's new ideas coming in, they're interacting with Indian ideas and producing something new which works in India rather than Japan.
Right. Okay. Ashok Bhattacharya, let me put a different question on trade to you. You know, we import nuclear reactors, iron and steel from Japan, and we export mineral fuels and fish, and also some stones. How does that strike you in the context of what we are trying to develop here?
Well, you know, it's a reflection, what you said just now is a reflection of India's state of industrial development. And I think unless we actually use that $34 billion of investment that are coming in, that have been promised to make basic infrastructure a little more easy and more conducive to producing more industrial goods, I don't think the scenario will change. And that is my area of concern in this entire Indo-Japan Economic Cooperation Agreement, where we should, instead of focusing on showpiece projects like bullet train, I think it would be better to use that money to improve your basic infrastructure and improve the absorptive capacity of the Indian system, to use that money for upgrading the basic levels of infrastructure. Right. Otherwise, I think we'll remain stuck in the showpiece projects, and they will be neither here nor there.
Right. Yes.
I want to say, because I didn't complete what I was saying, which relates to his earlier point. That is that, you know, the Prime Minister Modi made a public commitment with respect to what we call ease of doing business in Japan. He declared it publicly, right? And he said he'll set up an office. Now, we know from other countries who joined the WTO earlier, including, for example, China, they used it as a lever to make it more general. So I am hopeful that a commitment which he has made to Japan, in my view, he takes these things very seriously, he can use it as a lever to ease the business all across, including domestic and for everybody. So that is the hopeful sign. And if that doesn't happen, I agree. I mean, the pessimistic thing emerges. So again, it's a question of which side you want to look at it.
Right. Okay. So, you alluded to China. So let me press that a little further. Is that something that could be a new kind of equation where we are actually in some position to make two countries compete for investing, and then we actually benefit because we potentially raise that absorptive capacity?
Yes, we shouldn't take it too far, but I think an element of competition is introduced. Now,
because we have a similar trade composition problem with China, right? And
trade is a tricky issue. I mean, I can come to that, but let me just finish your general point, because trade, again, I've spoken of this morning, but that requires a little more detail. So as far as competition, I think it has introduced a little bit of competition between various countries, particularly on the public funding, because a lot of Chinese activity abroad is really driven by the government. You may say they are private Chinese firms, but to me, that's all just superficial. It's really the government which decides. The party, actually.
In the case of Japan, you're saying the distinction is much
clear. They are
clear.
both, yeah. The distinction is very important. So yes, there will be, but it won't be. Yes, of course. Of course. And so we'll see that when, the Chinese president comes, and we'll see whether it's confirmed. But we can discuss that next time. So that's one part of it. But what I'm making is a slightly different point. What I'm saying is you can learn from other countries. Say, for example, if we were saying we are easing business for US companies, there would be a big hullabaloo. But he has promised the Japanese. And if that can be used as a lever to open up more generally for domestic needs, because unless the domestic, we won't get that corporate investment in manufacturing, etc. So eventually, foreign investment is generally, at maximum, it will be 10% of investment.
But it's a driver. It's a lubricant.
It's a lubricant.
Yeah,
right. It's a good lubricant. Very good. That's what my earlier point was. But eventually, ease of business has to be for everybody. And I'm hopeful that he will, he's given a direction. His government will have to use that to do it for everybody.
Okay. Ashok Bhattacharya, from your experience and with a healthy dose of skepticism, which you're known for now, how do you see announcements like this with the prospect of their turning into some form of reality?
Well, these are good signals. These are very important signals. But the ground reality is something different. Even as Prime Minister Modi was promising the Japanese investor the ease of doing business to be getting better in India, the global benchmark indices on India's competitiveness actually showed that India has fallen 10 notches. So I think the ground reality is pretty grim. And unless the promises made by the Prime Minister, as Arvind right now pointed out, are actually fulfilled and the steps are taken here by the Indian government to fulfill them, I think it will be one more such promise made which may not be fulfilled in its entirety, and which may be one more sorry state of affairs.
But do you, just to sort of rewind a little bit, do you see merit in having a strong sort of one-axis relationship, in this case India-Japan, though other relationships
I personally feel is this, that this visit of Mr. Modi to Japan is more important for non-economic reasons. And I think on the foreign policy side, on the defense side, I think it achieved much more in my view, and actually it presented India in a much stronger footing in this the Asian and the global geopolitical scenario than actually the money coming in, infrastructure. These are par for the course. This has to happen. But I think ensuring a secure and a vibrant relationship between India and Japan, seen in the context of China's position in Asia, and looking at in the entire Asian perspective, Asian security context, I think this visit was very successful in terms of ensuring for India a decent place in this scheme of things.
Right. So, Dr. Virmani, if we were to look ahead, what can we convert this into?
But I want to say a little bit on the foreign policy, because that's important. So the way I see it in the broader context is that this is, the direction of redirection he's setting is that economic and technological progress of India will drive the foreign and other policies. So this is, in some sense, the first, not first, there was the SARC, etc. I won't go into that. So what I think of it is that is what this has put in place, and it sends a signal to every other country that we are going to look at foreign relations now is how it helps us economically,
Yeah.
with
So the
economic
economic
program,
prism
and
yeah.
technological,
Right.
which includes both civilian and defense.
Right.
So in that sense...
And you're saying the building blocks are being
yeah,
built.
That's
being
right.
put
In
into
that
place.
sense, I'm 100% in agreement with what AK said, is that is going to be a very, very important in the foreign policy side.
Right, and that's a good note to end on. We've run out of time. Thank you very much, Dr. Virmani and Ashok Bhattacharya, for joining us. That's all we have time for in this edition of Policy Watch. We'll be back next week, same time. Thanks for watching.